Welcome to The Connector, where we connect North Carolina to ideas and North Carolinians to each other. This podcast series is from the Institute for Emerging Issues at North Carolina State University. And now to the conversation.
Welcome to The Connector. I'm your host, Jessica Solis Aguilar, Policy and Program Manager with the Institute for Emerging Issues here at NC State University. Today's episode is a special one. We will be hosting a special series on our Connector podcast called Water Wednesdays. This past February, IEI hosted the Future Forward Water Forum in 3 different locations simultaneously across North Carolina, bringing together local leaders to talk about the challenges and the opportunities facing water infrastructure in their communities. We were able to be hosted in Asheville, Winston-Salem, and Morehead City. Each region brought a unique perspective from coastal resilience to watershed health and to disaster recovery with infrastructure challenges across the state. Today, I'm excited to be joined by 3 speakers who are part of those regional conversations. We have Kerri Allen, Scott Elliott, and Emily Sutton. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
As we've heard throughout the series, North Carolina's water systems are under increasing pressure from rapid population growth to more frequent and severe weather events. But what stood out across all 3 forums is that while these challenges differ by different regions, many of the underlying issues like infrastructure gaps, land use decisions, and the need for better coordination are deeply connected. Today, we're going to reflect on what we heard across the state and explore what it means to build a more resilient, future-forward water system. Scott, I want to start with you. Drawing from the conversation at your regional forum and your experience in disaster recovery, what are some of the biggest infrastructure gaps or preparedness challenges that came up?
Yeah, well, happy Water Wednesday to you. Thank you for the invitation. It's good to see all of you. I'm Scott Elliott. I'm Deputy Director of the Governor's Recovery Office for Western North Carolina. Governor Stein created GROW NC immediately after the storm on his first day in office. And I work with and lead our team here in Western North Carolina that serves our local communities in helping them to communicate with our state and federal partners. We advocate for our local communities and their needs, and we're directly involved in helping to solve problems here in our local communities. And so I really enjoyed our conversation at the Asheville convening, and I'm glad to get to see colleagues from the convenings, the other parts of the state. I imagine that our conversations were probably very similar, but understandably, the conversation for the day in Asheville revolved heavily around our experience over the last year and a half from Hurricane Helene. So as a lifelong resident of Western North Carolina, I can tell you we've known for a long time that our water systems and water infrastructure, from clean drinking water to wastewater to storm water, were increasingly under strain due to the rapid growth that we have experienced in our region over the last few decades, and also just because we've gotten behind in our investment in that infrastructure. It was mentioned several times by panelists all throughout the day, the evaluation that probably many of our listeners today are going to be familiar with. It was the American Society of Civil Engineers who do evaluations of water infrastructure across the country. And the report card for North Carolina was not positive. I'm a former teacher, and so these grades stood out to me. A C+ for our drinking water, a C- for our storm water, D+ for the condition of our dams, which is very concerning to all of us, and a D+ for our wastewater systems. It really is a glaring admission to us that we have fallen behind and that we are increasingly vulnerable, both due to the age and condition of that infrastructure, but to the growth and the pressure that we're putting on those systems because of the growth throughout our region. It's estimated that in the coming decades in North Carolina, not just Western North Carolina, we're going to need over $20 billion of investment to upgrade our drinking water infrastructure, at least that much, $21 billion for our wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. I'm really proud that Governor Stein and his administration have invested over $1.4 billion in infrastructure for water systems across the state. I believe over 568 million of that to Helene affected communities. But it's just, I guess I'll be the first to use the pun, the drop in the bucket for us here. But so aging infrastructure was the first and top topic. But the second, and a common theme throughout the day, was the concern about the growing labor shortage for having a skilled labor, both for the construction of these complicated and highly technical systems. So construction labor and technicians to be able to install them, but also the skilled labor and professionals that are required to operate these systems. We're seeing, as it's true in many professions, more people are retiring from these professions than we are attracting new people into the profession. And that is an especially difficult issue here in Western North Carolina, where it is becoming increasingly expensive and difficult to live or to attract people or to keep our youngsters or young professionals in our communities. A recent report about cost of living in Western North Carolina indicated that several of the communities in Western North Carolina lead the state in lack of affordability. It's among the least affordable places to live in Western North Carolina. So attracting professionals to work in these industries or in these systems is really difficult. Then the third thing that was mentioned, and I believe this was probably true in the other sessions as well, is just the growing concern about the funding of these. So I mentioned that the investment that is going to be required in the coming decades. Unfortunately, we've seen over the last year the vulnerability of our recovery efforts from Helene and the funding for those efforts to political changes and political instability. Now, that has improved in the last couple of weeks as we're recording this, but political instability and also changes in how public infrastructure is funded. There's a conversation going on at the state right now about changing or restricting how local communities can assess properties or administer local property taxes. And as more responsibilities fall to local governments are concerned about how these important projects are going to be funded. So aging infrastructure, the labor shortage that we are facing, and the stability of funding streams were what we heard all throughout the day in Asheville.
Thank you. And I want to open up, I want to ask, are these challenges unique to certain regions? I know that you were in the Asheville location, but I also know that we do have some different perspectives in the room. So are any of you seeing these same issues across the state?
Yeah, I'll chime in. That was also a big focus of the meeting in the Piedmont, that there was not a lot of people replacing the jobs in these infrastructure fields. But I wonder too if it's not necessarily an inspiring place to work, because the people that I work with directly that work in water utilities management or stormwater or drinking water or wastewater, they're constantly met with, we can't do more. The policy is not set in place. We're not allowed to do more. We can't set permits. We can't set limits on permits. And so it's not necessarily an inspiring place to be if you're a young person who is going into the workforce and everyone in that field is just doing the bare minimum of what they're legally allowed to do.
Yeah, and I'll add in as well, that was a common theme at our session in Morehead City, just the aging out of the workforce. These people who are doing so much for these communities and who are the reason that these communities are still thriving and existing don't have a strong enough seat at the table, like Emily said, to really influence the things that allow them to be able to do what they need to do. And something else that came up time and time again throughout the day was how they have these incredibly talented, skilled workers, but a lot of them can't pass the right tests or certifications needed to stay in these positions. And so potentially a reform at how that training and certification process works, and be able to capture these local residents who are, the hearts of these communities and who have the skills, but don't necessarily always reflect that on paper.
Thank you. And Scott, I just want to ask you, in your role, we have seen, or in your role, I don't know how involved you are with other storms that happen. We've seen Tropical Storm Chantal hit the Piedmont pretty hard. I'm originally from Eastern North Carolina, so storms is something we just always prepare for. Hurricane season is something that we know is always coming, but just curious if you've seen or heard if these challenges are unique to regions or if it's just the storms are getting harder and harder and the state of North Carolina is experiencing them at that same level. I think Helene is a storm that impacted the West in a way we never imagined. But I think that is a question, the fear of what is this going to look like in other parts of the state too.
I think you were hearing that these basic issues are the same across the state. Whether you're in the coastal plain or the Piedmont or in the mountains, we cannot ignore our aging infrastructure. We have to create the conditions to grow our labor force, and we have to have the funding streams and systems in place to be able to support them. I think it is unfortunate, but perhaps a silver lining of Helene is seeing the scope and scale of the damage in places, as you've seen, that we never perhaps allowed ourselves to admit that it could occur, at least on this scale. And maybe is a wake-up call or a warning for folks that either live in parts of our state where they don't think they're as vulnerable, or maybe to places in the state where we think that we're accustomed to storms, but as storms get stronger or more violent or create more damage, we need to be better prepared. Now, as the name of our office suggests, the Governor's Recovery Office for Western North Carolina, we've been committed and focused and dedicated to the recovery in Western North Carolina. And since Helene, we've been fortunate that the storms that we have experienced in the state have been able to be served from the state's response by our very capable colleagues at the Department of Emergency Management, the Department of Environmental Quality, and Department of Public Safety. And doing all the things that they are so skilled and trained at doing. But we are having a conversation about how should the state and local governments be organized to better respond to the growing size and scale and impact of storms moving forward. There are certainly some lessons learned. I know this conversation here is about water infrastructure, but it really goes hand in hand with our conversation about lessons that we learned from Helene and how we better respond to disasters in the future.
Right. Thank you. Emily, your work is connected to watershed health and land use. Across the forums, what did you hear about how communities are balancing growth and development while also protecting water resources? And where are you seeing the biggest disconnects between policy, planning, and on-the-ground reality?
Well, I appreciate that I get to follow Scott because I think you really teed me up for this one. So in our conversations in the Piedmont, Tropical Storm Chantal was still very much on everyone's mind, but we're also in a drought. We've been in a drought. We were in a drought during that meeting. We're still in a drought right now. So a lot of the conversations really focused on how our drinking water supplies are so incredibly vulnerable right now. The supply amount itself is being stretched, and you contrast that to almost a year ago when the Haw River watershed and much of the Eno and around the Triangle were completely inundated with floodwaters, and the storm lingered, and so the groundwater was completely saturated, so there was nowhere for the water to go. Our cities have not been designed in a way that can handle that amount of floodwater or is forward thinking enough to hold on to that water in times like this when we're in a drought. So our cities have been designed in a way to manage stormwater to get water away as fast as possible. And that is not working. We've seen time and time again that our downstream communities of these urbanized areas where there's so much pavement and impervious surface, it floods very quickly. Our river is very flashy, and so there's not a lot of warning. Tropical Storm Chantal specifically, I was also personally impacted by that flood, and I watched the river gauge, and it was not projected to flood like it did. The river rose about 22 feet in 5 hours, and in large part because there's nowhere for the water to go. So designing our cities with green stormwater infrastructure in mind, having constructed wetlands, having more retention ponds, stronger buffer regulations, all of that would build towards climate resiliency in times of flood and in times of drought. It seems like our number one cash crop this part of the state is condos and housing. And so populations are increasing. We continue to build more and more houses to bring more and more people, but we're not really evaluating the water supplies. Right now, there's a plan in place to reevaluate the Triangle Water Supply Partnership, to reevaluate the water supply within Jordan Lake. That plan is looking to provide water to Orange County, Chatham County, Wake County, and Durham County. And there's only so much water in that lake. And so the proposal is looking at alternative supplies. How can we reevaluate a sediment pool? Is there actually more water in the lake than we had previously estimated? But we're not limiting development by the amount of our resources. We're finding ways to reevaluate the amount of water that currently exists to accommodate our growth and expansion. And that should not be how this policy works.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I want to make sure I leave a chance to let our other panelists add anything before I move on.
I would just like to add one more thing about the flood management, if I can. One thing that Scott mentioned was that Scott's department is really focused on Western North Carolina, as it should be. That storm really devastated Western North Carolina, and much hasn't recovered yet, even a year and a half later. When Chantal happened, we found that a lot of our municipalities, a lot of our counties had plans on the books for how to respond to floods, but those plans weren't ready to be implemented. And they had written plans for what to do, but when it happened, there was not a way to move quickly. Those local governments operated in silos. So the reaction that Alamance County residents got from their community health department was much different than the reactions that we had in Orange County from the community health department. Emergency management rapid responders rescued over 100 people through swiftwater rescues. And by the end of a 2-day period, they started telling us that communities needed to be relying on local organizations, nonprofits like us, local mutual aid hubs, because the county departments did not have the resources or the capacity to continually respond to these emergencies. That's really concerning. As we continue to have no budget at our state level, and those positions are being cut, we're going to continue to see these massive storm events as the climate continues to change. And we need to be thinking in a more holistic approach how to collaborate in an emergency response situation as a region and not isolated in county and municipal lines.
That reminds me of two other themes that emerged from our conversation in Asheville. One was about the difficult and uncomfortable conversation around land use planning, especially in communities that have been very averse to any kind of zoning or planning ordinances. But because of Helene restructuring and reshaping the nature of our waterways, we're seeing places flood now in Western North Carolina with, let's make this up, but 4 or 5 inches of rain that previously only flooded maybe in a significant tropical storm kind of event. So it doesn't take much rain now to overflow the banks of streams and tributaries and rivers, or to back up those stormwater systems, simply because of the way that Helene changed the nature of the rivers and streams. So that's one conversation, is that maybe the places that were safe before aren't safe anymore, and we're going to have to take a look at land use planning. The growth question aside, but that's certainly a part of it. And that leads to another important conversation that was had throughout the day, which is about the importance of land conservation. And we have a very robust system of nonprofit land trusts throughout throughout North Carolina, but especially in Western North Carolina, who I think we are in the process of evaluating their scope of work beyond the great work that they've been doing around large anchor conservation projects, around large state parks or federal properties, but now looking more from a resilience perspective. What land needs to be preserved so that the water can go somewhere and be absorbed? And then third, around building standards. I know that in our community, we just built a brand new elementary school to replace a school that consistently flooded. And it was really impressive, the technology that was put into the school, significant water retention systems under the parking lot, for example, to be able to slow, to not only hold the water, but allow it to cool, to allow contaminants to settle before that water was released back into other waterways. So I'm encouraged that new technologies are being implemented, but we also need to think differently about how we use the land in the first place.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for being so open and honest about, what are people, our community facing every day as they're impacted by these kind of storms. I think this segues pretty well to you, Kerri, kind of bringing in that coastal perspective. Coastal communities are often on the front lines of storms and sea level rise. What themes or challenges came up in your region, and how did they connect to what you're seeing in inland communities?
Definitely. So I'm Kerri Allen. I work for the North Carolina Coastal Federation. We are a nonprofit that works to protect and restore the coast. And we work in all 20 of our coastal counties. So we're very fortunate to be able to work in some partnership form or fashion with most of the people in the room at the Morehead City event. So I'm going to start with infrastructure, because that's really where everything is converging for us right now, and something we spoke a lot about in our session. And in coastal communities, we're seeing systems really push past capacity. Stormwater, wastewater, roads, even basic services, largely because growth is happening so quickly. And there have been a lot of parallels between the inland and western regions with us here at the coast. And even throughout our conference in Morehead, a lot of the more inland areas, some of their struggles are based around losing population. However, we are booming in population. Many places we're adding residents faster than the infrastructure can realistically keep up. And that growth is colliding with climate pressures. As we've talked about, more intense storms, rising seas, higher groundwater tables means that systems that were designed for a very different set of conditions are now failing more frequently. What has worked for the last 50 years is not going to work for the next 50. Like Scott was talking about, with places that hadn't flooded before, we're seeing that all up and down the coast. Flooding isn't just a storm event anymore. It's becoming a chronic, everyday challenge in some places, and it's the new norm, and we have to figure out how to adapt. Sunny day flooding, nuisance flooding. If you talk to any of the local government staff here at the coast, that is really probably more on their minds than these intense storm events. And on that note, another theme that came up is how nature-based solutions really need to become the rule and not the exception. We can't build our way out of this with traditional infrastructure anymore. Protecting and restoring wetlands, floodplains, marshes isn't just an environmental priority from groups like mine. It's essential infrastructure for managing flood risk, improving water quality, and maintaining some level of resilience as our conditions change, as our norm changes. And so I think while the growth pressures look different throughout the state, many of the underlying challenges, aging infrastructure, flood risk, water management are shared. Our inland areas are seeing the limits of traditional approaches, especially in flood-prone areas. And so even though our coastal communities may be feeling the impacts, a little bit more acutely at times due to rapid growth and sea level rise, we all need to rethink how and where we invest in this infrastructure, and to try to central natural systems as part of that. And I think that's something that we have in common and can hopefully, work towards in all the ways that have already been discussed today.
Thank you, Kerri. Well, I want to open up for quick reflection. Based on your experience at each forum location, based off the conversation we've been having today, what are some takeaways that have stood out to you the most? And where do you see the greatest opportunity for North Carolina to take a more coordinated statewide approach to water resilience?
I'll start with one thought. Something else that really came up at the forum, and I think Emily may have alluded to this earlier, how we need to be coordinated regionally, but also not even just regionally and with other municipalities and governments and counties, but I think a little bit more holistic approach, even within a single government. Right now, everything can be very siloed. And, as we're learning, nothing happens in a vacuum. People come at things from different perspectives, different experiences, different priorities, but there's so much overlap, especially when it comes to the physical, the human, and the environmental health and safety that's associated with flooding. And so I think taking a step back and looking at how we can pool those resources a little bit more collectively, both internally within existing systems and then branching out to more partners on a regional basis, is something that's going to be the make or break in the future.
Right.
And I'll just add, I think that the regionalization piece was a huge takeaway from our meeting as well. One thing that I was struck by is that there were so many environmental advocates and people that work in the utilities or the permitted regulatory space, and I am hopeful that both of our all of our work can be more cohesive. I think that for a long time, the regulated communities have been very hesitant to have any stronger water quality protections or permitting on drinking water facilities, permitting at wastewater levels. But now that we're thinking about how vulnerable our drinking water supplies are, how fragile our wastewater infrastructure and dam infrastructure is, and what catastrophic results can happen very quickly in a flood event or in a drought event, I'm hopeful that that gap can kind of come together a little bit more to see that we're all on the same side here. We're trying to protect our communities and have a resilient future. And so North Carolina can be ready for what comes next.
I'll just add the recurring theme at our convening was just how much everyone loves our state, and that people are drawn to live here for the natural beauty, the natural resources, the quality of life, which certainly includes things like our natural resources and not taking for granted, being able to open the faucet and get water out every day. But also a growing awareness that we can't continue to ignore these growth issues, and that addressing them moving forward will have to be different than the way we've done it in the past. And while I mentioned the example of new technology for storm water catchment, I think a theme of our session, and I might have been one of the first to say it, is we need to pay attention to our land and to our natural resources, and that there is a natural carrying capacity for how much our water and land resources can support. And we need to pay attention to that and watch and listen. And that may mean that we need to invest more money in land conservation, buffers along our rivers, increase not just the storm water treatment and catchment, but things like the elevation of our bridges, increasing the capacity of our culverts and drains and things like that. But we have to take action, and we can't wait, because it will only become a more difficult problem to solve. On the positive side, just like our other panelists here today, the room in Asheville was filled with highly skilled, knowledgeable, very well-intended people who have a lot of skill and knowledge and know how to address these issues if policymakers, lawmakers, and funders will listen and take action.
Thank you, Scott. I think, my big takeaways is we need to watch, listen, and invest. I appreciate each of you being with us today and kind of sharing a little bit about, what was talked about at each of your locations. What does it look like to have a more resilient North Carolina? I want to thank you for being a part of this important conversation, for the work you do every day with our communities. These aren't easy challenges for sure, but these conversations like this are critical to helping North Carolina move to reacting and planning ahead. And I agree that the time to make action, to do something is now. So thank you for joining us and bringing these regional conversations together. It's clear that while North Carolina's water challenges look different from the coast to the mountains, and in between, those solutions require a lot of collaboration and coordination and a shared vision for the future. So I appreciate each of you joining us today, and joining all of the listeners who listened into the Connector podcast. To learn more about IEI's Future Forward water work and what's next, you can visit emergingissues.org. Until next time, let's stay connected.
This has been a presentation from the Institute for Emerging Issues at North Carolina State University. To learn more, please visit us at emergingissues.org.